So yeah, I'm McKendrick, and I work at Hello Games, and we're a small indie team based in Guildford, which is kind of near London in the UK. Last year, or a year and a half ago now, we were responsible for shipping No Man's Sky, which is like a sci-fi exploration game based around procedural generation. So today I'm going to be talking about working with change, and that comes a bit from the fact that we launched this game and we didn't just leave it as it was. We've continued to make updates since then, and that's a very normal process for games these days, but I want to talk a bit about the way that procedural generation impacts that. And more than that, I want to talk a bit about the way that procedural generation in future could impact that, and ways that we could be working with procedural generation to change the way that we're updating and creating these continuously evolving games. There we go, okay. So, like I said, this is about No Man's Sky, but it's not really about the specifics of how we generate No Man's Sky. And that's partly just because a lot of that information is already out there. For example, I gave a talk at GDC last year, and that's on YouTube for free. So if you want to know specifics of that, you can look that one up, but I'm happy to answer questions about it and stuff instead. But today I want to talk about what makes us a little bit different, and that is the update process that we've gone through since, especially since a lot of that wasn't a straightforward process. A lot of it has been quite painful, and I want to talk about those challenges and the decisions that we've made to improve our ability to update the game, but sometimes we've made them far later down the line than other teams could with this information. So this is going to be a bit ephemeral, a bit high level, rather than really specific technical info for a lot of it, even though I am going to introduce some specific techniques that we've worked with as examples. And that's partly because for me, procedural generation is this constant balance, even as a programmer, between code and design. I think when I work with procedural generation on a really large scale, then I can't not also think about game design, and I can't not also think about art as a programmer. And hopefully this talk is going to kind of encapsulate that and get coders in the room to also be thinking about design and art right through all the work that they're doing. So for those of you that haven't played it, let's go through a bit about what No Man's Sky is. So the basic premise is that we're generating a universe. And what that really means is we're generating individual solar systems within this universe, and then individual planets within those solar systems. And then on those planets, we're generating terrain, we're generating creature models and their behaviors, we're generating foliage that sits on it. And we're doing that all in real time as you move around the world. So a lot of the techniques we've heard about today about Houdiniing things are done offline, and when we work online, then a lot of what we do can be simpler, but performance is super critical in all of that. So this is the original box copy that we shipped in August 2016. The 10th of August was my birthday. And since then, we've released a few major updates. So the first one, the foundation update, that came about maybe 3 or 4 months after, I think. I'm going to talk through what these updates introduced, and through that I want you to think about how that might impact you if you're generating a game and you want to bring these features into it. So for example, in this update we let players own freighters, and suddenly that means that we have save data about the players that we're not storing on a planet. We can't be relative to these planets. We have to consider that off-world and in moving spaces. So there's a whole set of features there. We let the players build their own bases, and not only do we have to save those, but they need to sit on like a nice flattened bit of terrain, and that impacts the way that we generate that terrain and the things that we can do to change that terrain in future. And we let the player build objects for themselves, and those objects can be out in the wild. So again, that means suddenly we have data that the players created, that they've stored, that's sitting out on that terrain. So if we want to come across and change a whole bunch of terrain later, then there's suddenly player state that we have to take into account. Our next update, the Pathfinder update, that kind of focused on vehicles and exploration. So in that one, we introduced brand new terrain shapes. And that's partly just because we wanted the world to be more explorable. A lot of people said after these updates that they found it much easier to get about the world. They were more keen to go and see places and find them. And that might seem like it's a bunch of design choices, and it is, but most of those design choices were remodeling our terrain and making it more navigable, and that means changing our procedural techniques. And on top of that, we have vehicles, and we need terrain that the vehicles can drive around that makes sense for them, and that's like a different scale and speed from the way our players will navigate terrain. So again, that goes back and influences the way that we want to generate. Not only that, but we introduced some online content sharing. So we let players share the bases that they built in the previous update. And again, that's some more state that's stored and shared between people that we have to care about in all these techniques. And then our most recent update, the Atlas Rises update, and that one was really about narrative and introducing a better tutorial and a more epic story. But it still brought up about a lot of things that we wanted to do to impact the game. So we actually restructured the way that our galaxy worked, and we did that in order to bring greater changes between different solar systems you could be in, and new different types of planets, some like weird biomes that are made of like weird hexagonal shapes or bubbles and things like that to add variety. And the way that we did that impacted the biome choices across loads of planets in our galaxy. But looking back, if we'd, from the very start before we shipped, if we'd taken into account better how we want to add biomes, then we could have made that a much smoother experience. And that's the kind of thing I want to talk about today. Not only that, but we added direct terrain editing, so suddenly our terrain used to be this asset that we generated in-game that was like the sole responsibility of the game. And you could edit it a bit, you could fire grenades, create holes in it, and those would be respected. We didn't have the large-scale edits that we have now. And again, this brings in this interplay between us generating the world as you move around it, but also being able to change it and respect the player's state and making the player make impactful changes in the world that might not be that relevant if we change all of the terrain. And we also added some multiplayer exploration, which again, because the game's all deterministic, wasn't a huge change for generation, but does need like different terrains and different player state to be respected. So what we have is these player orbs that can play locally and you can see each other, but if one player has local terrain edits, then those won't be seen by another player. And that's, again, like a design choice that we made, whereas if we wanted to like make that fuller, then there are like so many more things to do with generation that would have to be considered. And we're still working on the game, so I'm still happy to talk about that. Not about the secrets that are in our next update, but we've got one coming this year, and we're bringing the game to a whole bunch more platforms. So moving on from talking just about No Man's Sky, I want to kind of generalize a bit and break down the timescale for generation. So we're talking about change in generation, and that means automatically that we have to consider and start talking about time. And the first consideration is when we do our generation. So this breakdown is kind of obvious, but I think sometimes it's so obvious that it's not given proper design consideration about the implications for updating your game for later change. So our first option is that we generate everything entirely offline, that we bake our assets, that we use something like Houdini, and then what we actually load in the game, what our end users load is a traditional set of data. So they have assets, those assets are on disk or in a download, and they're loaded in the game. Our next option is that we generate online but ahead of time. So that's maybe on a load screen or something as you're going into the game. And our third option is that we're generating constantly, that we're continuously generating content at real time as the player moves around in it. So to go into a bit more detail, with our entirely offline data, that gives us like a really traditional flow once we get into the game. Our data's stored, our data's loaded. So that stuff can mostly be used for like supporting our creatives, our artists, our audio developers, or designers, as we've heard earlier today. So examples of that are like Houdini and texture tools, and our limitations are all the same typical limitations that we'd have from traditional content, so disk space, or load times, memory use. Our next option is that we're generating online but ahead of time. So we're generating these things in games, so suddenly we have to care more about load times and the performance that involves during the creation process, but we hopefully reduce the total amount of content that is loaded. And our example would be like if you're loading into a dungeon crawler and you generate that whole level all ahead of time. That's generation done in the game and done over a very limited period of time. You can maybe have a few seconds of the player's time to do that, but not like 45 minutes to bake out light maps and things. But then our next step, continuously at runtime, is where the performance implications really hit. We're doing this concurrent with gameplay, so whatever time we've dedicated for processing game logic, we at the same time have to be generating our world or whatever content that we're creating at the same time. And I think sometimes I underestimate that because I think about No Man's Sky and I look at all these other amazing titles out there and look how their worlds look and the kind of AI that they're able to handle and the things that they can do in a frame. And then I remember how much of every frame we dedicate just to generating another piece of the world that lies ahead of you. And like this is a huge processing task. But at the same time, it brings about benefits in that we don't have that much data to load, so it can reduce our load times depending how much we generate and load in those. But also it just lets us create a world that is so much bigger than we could possibly store on disk, a world that's so much bigger than we could hope to load into, and we can continuously create that as someone moves around. And for us, because we're creating a deterministic world, then that means you're moving into spaces, and the player should be the equivalent of if you'd loaded that set of data. But for other games, those could change as you move around. You could have implications of where you are impacting what happens next in the game, depending on the kind of thing you're making, which is the kind of thing that you couldn't achieve just from loading traditional data. So what about specifically No Man's Sky? We do all three of those things. So our artists use tools that are entirely offline. They create, for example, our terrain textures. And a lot of the assets they create will be like recolored in game, reconstituted and recombined with other assets. For example, creatures, they'll create loads of different creature parts, but then we'll build those together in game into a hero model. But they can still use procedural tools, not always ones that we've written, outside of the game, just creating those in the way that traditional content would be created in the game. And we also use a bunch of input assets, so we generate like noise textures for handling our noise in game, and textures for the water and things are all baked from maps and other tools. And then we do a bunch of loading ahead of time. So that's, for example, building our creatures like I was talking about before. This is the point at which we recombine all of those model parts. So if we want to build a certain creature, we'll decide upon a whole bunch of model parts in like a tree-like structure. We'll traverse that tree, picking a head and then a body and then different accessories that get applied to that. And we can do all that at warp time, which for us is like a time between moving between set bits of space, or the time when you initially load into the game. We also build textures by combining a series of different texture parts, so we can create like a creature texture that has spots or stripes by combining different layers and coloring them differently. And we generate all our gameplay details. So for our solar system, we know what those are going to be ahead of time. We know that they're locked in once you get to a system, so we can generate the kind of biomes that planets will have, the type of foliage that they'll have, the type of creatures that will exist in that system, and we can generate that just once, and there's no like real benefit to doing that continuously. But I do want to say that a bunch of the stuff that I said that we do at warp time, we've actually moved over to streaming systems. And that's streaming systems that handle not just the fact that you're loading all those like component assets, but we've moved them over to doing the generation as well. So that means that reduces our memory footprint. So when you move between different planets now, then we can unload and load the entire set of foliage, which again just gives us that memory to budget somewhere else. So similar to any other modern game, we have texture streaming, but it also takes into account our procedural content. And then finally, the most significant amount of generation in our game is done as you move around. So we work on a log-based system, as you can kind of see on the right. But that's not good at left and right. So we work on this grid system. We split the world into regions, and each region doubles in size as you go through successive LODs. So you have a small number of the highest LOD and a much larger number of the largest LOD off in the distance. And as you move between those, we drop some regions out of memory and then generate the ones coming up to you. And that generation process can sound kind of simple when you think about the work involved in generating a terrain. Like our terrains are quite complicated at this point. They involve loads of layers of different noise, but the terrain generation process in general is something that you can easily experiment with, probably have done. But the thing that makes it really complicated is all the typical gameplay things that you would bake offline that we now have to create when you get into the game. So on the left, you can see the process that we go through for every individual region as it goes from being generated into coming into play and being usable in the game. So we first generate that terrain that's voxel-based. We then apply all the player's edits that are relevant to that region. We then polygonize it, so we have our geometry. Then the fun thing, because our planets are spheres, and a lot of people don't realize that our planets are like literally spheres. There's no trick there. You're walking around a sphere when you're on the bottom of the planet. then your like world normal is pointing down. When you're on top of the planet, your world normal is pointing up. Physics programmers love it, obviously. So a fun thing that we have to do with this geometry, once we've created this flat region, is spherify all of it. So we warp it onto this sphere, and then it's in our world space. Then we get to do the really fun tasks that that would really benefit from being offline, but we don't have an option since we're generating our terrain. So that's, for example, generating all of our physics. That takes some time. Our creatures need nav meshes to move around, so we have to generate all of the AI data that they know about the world. That has to be done in real time. Then we have to place buildings on top of the terrain, and they need to sit in flat sections of it, so we have a system that does that. And all of our foliage placement, all of those like gorgeous patterns that we saw coming from Houdini and other games earlier, we need to do a simplified version that we run on GPU, and we have to do that online for every region, and we're handling stuff like that every single frame, which places a real limitation on how much we can do based on, say, how fast the player can move around. So when I brought up something like us introducing vehicles to the game, that's like, oh, suddenly we need to generate 3 times as fast because you can drive there 3 times as fast, and we need to get that content, generated and playable by then. But talking about time, there's significantly larger complications than just when we're generating our content. And this mostly applies to the content that's generated in games, but later I'll try to think about ways that we can also apply it to content that's generated offline. Next, so here's what we hope will happen when we make a game. So we build this lovely generator, it gets exactly the content we want, and it's deterministic, and our output's amazing, our game looks great, the players love it, testers are having a really good time with it, and we will like never touch it again, so we can just happily put that game out there, probably retire to the Bahamas, sit on a beach, play with all these like side projects that we've wanted to do for ages, and drop and never think about this again. But of course that's not how modern game development looks. What we actually do is we ship a game, and then we ship that game again, and then we ship it again and again multiple times. We release updates. Maybe we do an early alpha, so we're really tied to this process of releasing a game multiple times. But even if we don't do any of that, then the development process itself is really iterative. We have to go through that, and that involves creating the game over and over and having testers work with it. And I know there are a lot of students here, so that can be a huge separation from the way that you do project work in university, where you might create a thing and then you hand it off and you get your grade for the thing, and then you're probably done with it. But it's important to think of games in modern development as these things that are not complete when they're shipped, but as this ongoing process. And we've seen that with MMOs for a long time, but more and more we see that with games that maybe have a multiplayer component, but are like massively multiplayer, and we see it more and more with single player games as well through early alphas and things like that. So I think if you can adjust your thinking to think of games in those terms, then you get a real advantage when you come to work on them forever. So why is that a problem? So with traditional content, if we want to make a small isolated change, we want to change a texture, we just change that texture. But now suddenly if we want to change a texture, that texture was generated, so we need some dirty hack, or we need a means of being able to change things in a much more controllable way. Minor changes that we make to our generators can often make a really dramatic change to their output. And without thinking ahead, then we could be in a position where we can't change things, or where changes to one thing introduce really huge changes in an area that we don't want. It can be difficult to even identify those changes. For example, in No Man's Sky, if I double the spacing of some specific plants that we have placed on our terrain, then suddenly the game becomes unplayable. It's like monumentally difficult to keep all your systems charged and things. But I could easily do that with a generator. I could accidentally have a tree appear, half as often, and not even notice until someone's really closely playing through it. And finally, like often we're going to have players already out there in our game, whether that's early alpha or updating a live game, or whether we just have testers. And we need their state to be maintained. They need to be able to keep playing that game after we've made all those changes. So in that way, change is a conflict between the fact we want to update this game, we want to make it better, we want to introduce these changes that are going to make it more enjoyable for our players, but at the same time we're like fighting off unintended consequences, we're fighting with being able to let people continue to play the game and have this smooth and continuous experience. So what can we do? I'm not going to tell you, but I will go through some options, and I will go through what we did, and I don't think it's necessarily The best thing to do if you have the resources and time to plan ahead, but I think it is super relevant and useful. But the most critical thing is just that you're thinking about this problem, you're thinking about it before you ship rather than waiting until you do your first update. So our first thing we can do is, thanks to this stock photo man, we can never change generation ever again. And I mean, he's smiling kind of sarcastically there. This is a really realistic option. I mean, for a lot of AAA games, that is their option. You know, players there, I think, expect a specific bar of consistency and quality that won't let you pull the game out from under their feet and replace it with something different. So I think with these like really highly polished AAA games, then this probably is the realistic approach, is to have generators that ship and don't change that much after they ship. Our next option is we duplicate all of the code that we use for generation every time we update. And the reason that there's a picture of spaghetti is because that's kind of how I imagine your code base after you've done a couple of updates. But joking aside, again, this isn't the worst idea either. There might be a nice solution where we have this, data-oriented solution, and we can load in different generators. Every time we update, we can change that generator and use our old one for older content and have additive content in that one by adding new generators to it. But it, again, limits the amount of code that we're able to change. Our third one, we can handle things just by changing our player's state. So we could say our player exists in the world, and we don't care if we replace that world completely. We make it totally different and just let the player keep existing in it. We'll move them to a place where it's not going to crash and where they're not going to fall through the terrain. We'll keep as much information about their state as we can, but basically we're just going to move their state into a game world that can be very different and allow them to continue in that, which again might not be the worst solution depending on the kind of game you're making, the kind of players that you have and their expectations for how that's going to work, whether it's a game that's really explorative and experimental, then this is a much more reasonable thing, or if you're like in an early alpha, then if you have something where players expect the game to remain exactly the same forever. Our fourth option is we can build robustness to change into our generators. Now this is an option that definitely has its limits. There's a limit to which you can want to change things in your game, but also keep things the same. That's not something that balances well. But there are definitely things we can do in every generator that we write to build some robustness in so that we can make sure that changing them changes only the things that we want to change and doesn't cause unintended consequences across the world. So we can have the control there that our generators can be updated without everything else in the game changing, without having these huge knock-ons that are undesirable. And our fifth option, if this was like that exploding brain meme, then this would be like galaxy brain, I guess. We can design for a continuously changing world. We can expect that the game is going to change, and we can design a game that relies on that change, that really wants that to happen. So, we could have narrative that's based on the fact that this world will be changing over time and that our updates will change things, and then position the player in it so that makes sense to them and is interesting. So those are kind of like high-level, nebulous things, but what do those actually mean? How do you approach doing any of those things? Again, not going to tell you, but I will go through some pointers on how I think that can work. So I can talk about what we do in practice. So the first thing we do is we definitely work to increase the robustness in our generators, and that's really an ongoing process for us. Identifying ways that we've introduced changes that we don't want, or areas that are changing more rapidly than we'd expected, that we tend to want to change every update rather than once occasionally. And we can try and make those more robust and make the players save more robust to those. We can build flexible gameplay systems, so we can make a world that works regardless of location. So for us, that might be, say, a mission system in game that will work even if you move it to the other side of the solar system and have an entirely different set of buildings and NPCs and things to contend with. Or it might be that the players have built their bases and then we changed all of the terrain. So we need to have systems that let us relocate those bases from one location and let them continue as before, but on an entirely different planet. So like I said, this is an ongoing process, which kind of means that we've released updates where we've changed the player's state to adapt to it so that people can keep playing, where knowing what I know now and with a whole load of intense work, then it would be potentially possible to build generators that would be more robust to that would have led to fewer changes. And I think that work won't always make sense for all games. You know, maybe it is better to handle things in the player state, but it's important that you know that it was an option, that you're able to consider the trade-offs and decide whether that's something to put time into. So now I'm going to talk through a few specific techniques that we've used in our game and might be relevant to what you're doing. Or they might inspire you to look at different ways of structuring your generation in terms of data structures or algorithms, even if they're not like directly relevant to what you're doing. So to give a bit of background, when I visualize the structure of No Man's Sky, I think I look at a diagram a bit like this. So at the top we have maybe a solar system, and then I have a specific temperature of sun. It might be a specific, it might have a specific like level of trade. We know certain things about the solar system by generating them from the start. And the details about the solar system feed in, and they tell us how to generate the planets in it. They tell us the biomes that are going to be, the life level, the like NPC activity in buildings. And then from the data about those planets, we feed that down and we can decide, you know, the life level of them, how many creatures there are going to be, what kind of inhabitants are there, and also what kind of terrain they have. And then based on the terrain, we can know what kind of foliage sits on that, what kind of buildings and their positions. So it's like this top-down structure where generating one thing feeds directly into generating the next thing. And that's not like an abstract concept either. If you looked at our code, if you looked at our class structure, if you looked at the way we pass data between things, this top-down structure is really realistic. And I think that's not just us, even if it's not so explicitly reflected in code. That's really true for a lot of games that generate online. So for example, with a dungeon crawler, you might be generating that dungeon, and based on what you know about that dungeon, you're going to generate the different floors within it. So, and then you can take one of those, and you're going to generate individual rooms in that dungeon to build its overall structure. And then in a single room, we might say, in this room I'm going to place 3 enemies and 2 bits of treasure and some plants based on the things that I already generated from this room. So it feeds down nicely into this hierarchical structure. And you might look at your generators and decide that they don't have this structure, but again, the really important thing is that you know what structure they have, that you're able to visualize and think about your generation code and know how, from like a software design perspective, how that hierarchy looks. So the reason that I'm going through the structure of procedural generation, and the reason that I'm saying that it's really important that you know about this, is because so much of limiting change comes at this structural stage. We need to be able to compartmentalize the things that are changing. So I went through this dungeon crawler thing before, and I was saying we could generate things based on an individual room. But what if we didn't care about the individual room, and we moved things upstream, and instead we generated all that information about enemies, about treasure, about rewards and foliage and things at the level of the dungeon overall. We decided, like, I'm going to place 3 bosses and a dozen smaller enemies and scatter those across the level. Then, like, suddenly that's a level of change that's removed from it. We can add a room or remove a room, but that dungeon overall remains about the same difficulty. It remains the same kind of gameplay as before. So that's just like giving us that little bit of control and taking away that when there's unintended consequences. So you have some more flexibility there. So in general, you just want to move as much as you can information upstream and avoid having it flow down through other generators that it doesn't need to. And a big thing that leads on from that is to do in particular with seeds. So in a lot of generative techniques, the way that we get our randomness is through pseudo-random values that seed this generator. So we get different output, not just depending on the parameters that we pass in for what we specifically want, but depending on this seed value that we pass in. In ours, it's generally just these like 64-bit ints. But if you pass seeds down, if you create them in a generator and then pass them down to be used in something else, then you've added a level of lack of control that you didn't need to, because your seeds can always be generated entirely separate to that. You want to pass on data between your generators, like the bare minimum, and only stuff that gives context. That's why we have this structure, is because our solar system gives context for the planets in it. Our planet has context that, you know, our buildings and our terrain care about. But if we're passing data down through the structure, if we're having something generated by a level higher up that doesn't add context, we can strip it out. We can simplify things that way. So a technique that we use specifically is reseeding things based on like an array of pseudo-random values. So a big problem that I see in a lot of smaller projects especially is that you're generating pseudo-random numbers, and those depend on previously generated values, and you really want to strip that system as much as possible out of your generation. You don't want anything to be order dependent, and one way of removing order dependency is to do all of this generation up front. So, for example, we'll move out and generate this list of pseudo-random values, these seeds, and then later we can come back to them, and we can reseed our random generator based on them, and work from there. So we have like individual compartmentalized, yeah, that's the word, bits of code that rely on that value, but don't rely on anything prior to that. There's no ordering there anymore. The next big tip I have is to always assume when you're updating your game, you're going to add more stuff. I mean, that's a really normal thing. You're creating a game, you're probably going to want it to grow, you're going to want to add more things. And that seems obvious, but the reason I say it is that removing stuff is always a way simpler process. If you're removing something from your game, you're just deciding specifically what you want to remove and deciding whether you want to replace it with anything or just have nothing there. But when you're adding something, you have to work out whether adding that is just going to take up a new space in the world, whether it's going to replace all of something, whether you have systems that are going to generate entirely different output across the board just based on the fact that you wanted to add a new thing to your game. So a technique that we use to deal with that comes down to choosing your data structures. And again, the general principle here is think carefully about the data structures that you're using for generation. So if you consider your most simple generator, you have a list of things that you want to pick between, and you're just going to use a random value to pick which of those you're going to show. So you could have those things over on the left, and you're going to pick one of them as your foliage for the terrain. This is far simpler than any system really will be in most cases. But the issue with it, because it's the basis for a lot of other systems, is that if I then add something to this list, suddenly every time I call this random function, I'm going to get something different up. I'm going to say, I want to add a larger plant to this, and then every time I go to get a piece of foliage through this function, I'm going to get something entirely different. I've changed all of the plants in the world just because I wanted to add one item to my list. Whereas if we use sparse fixed size systems, so those can be grid-based when we're talking about position, or just a simple array, then we have the possibility of generating nothing, and it becomes incredibly clear when we add something, what it's replacing, whether it's replacing a space in the world, so we're increasing our overall density, or whether it's replacing a concrete object. And this can be literally the case. You can literally create arrays in data that look like this, that have the potential to return nothing from your function. But mostly I would generate these in games. So we'd have our different probability for things, and we'd generate our array to have spaces to be sparse, but still to be a fixed and consistent size, and to be consistent between updates. So for example, buildings in No Man's Sky are a place where this is used, or is being introduced at the moment, so that I can keep all of the same building generation across most of the planet, but add a random building at any point and make sure that none of the other buildings are impacted by that. Our next step is building flexible gameplay, like I mentioned before. So that's designing your systems to always be replicatable and be adaptable. So you're expecting that the player's state is going to work when you move it to a new part of the world, that you're going to have to change their save somewhere so they can keep playing. But every gameplay system that the player state depends on can also be handled this way. And you can build relocatable components into your generators as well. So perhaps for a building, I might be generating a specific shape of the terrain. But if I can apply that to any piece of our terrain, then I can have the same area for a building, regardless of where on the planet it lives. And more importantly than ever, you have to generate fallbacks. Because you're changing a generator that might have a really wide range of output, you have to assume that your output could change dramatically, and you can handle every case that comes from that. So the big obvious ones are the player falling under the world, but there's weirder cases that also have to be considered, and just as much as possible, robustness that would always be important when you're adding an update to a game becomes really significant when you're changing really significant parts of that game. The next significant thing is generating data that you're able, as a human, to read. So if your generators are these black boxes, you're kind of putting data in, you're doing this generation task, and you're getting this, lovely populated planet or this lovely fun experimental game out the other end, then you need to be able to see those inputs and outputs really clearly. You need to be able to track those. I consider our generators to be this means of just filling data structures for us. And I don't mean, again, like that's the thing I mean really literally. We have this metadata that is loaded in game and can be seen as text outside the game. Ours is XML, but it's not tied to that. It could be any data that you can easily read as a human or through some tool that you build, something like that. So that you can really quickly see what you're feeding into these generation functions and what you're getting back out. We can save ours out, so we can save an entire planet to disk, and rather than generating it, we can load all of the attributes about it. We can compare that data, so I can see the data that came out of the generator 6 months ago and see how it compares to the data that I'm getting out of that now, and I can see exactly what's different there. And that's really important when I make a change to a generator, that I can compare those data and make sure there's like not some weird class or something that's changed that I expected to remain constant, that I'm not introducing some change that the player is going to deal with that might be really hard for us to find down the line. So I can see exactly what our systems are doing through that. And obviously, to me, our systems aren't a black box because I'm a programmer and I can see them, but our artists also work with these. They create models and things, and they need to be able to see exactly what the output of those is. And that leads on to my next point, which is about making data that you can not only read, but that you can visualize, that you have nice ways of looking at. I think I include an image a bit like this in every talk that I do about No Man's Sky. And that's because there are still loads of people that haven't applied a visual approach like this, and it's one of the biggest things that I could like evangelize forever. When someone creates something, you need, if someone inputs something and it has a range of different outputs, you need to be able to see how broad those outputs are and how much variety they're getting amongst those outputs. And you need to be able to see whether that's changed, whether you've lost a load of variety. You need to be able to look and instantly know whether that looks like the kind of output that you want in your game. And that's a thing that, as a human, you can do so quickly. You can look at a range of output and be like, that looks kind of the same to me. Or I'm seeing that pattern repeating itself over and over and over again. And all you have to do is like generate in bulk, which has some performance implications. You need to be able to do it quickly, but just like have a way of seeing the output of your generator. You could have graphs and things to show the different content you're generating, but just seeing the actual content, screenshots of our planets, images of a model that our creatures, our artists won't appreciate that one, that our artists have created, and then being able to see all of the outputs of their work. And then feeding on from that is testing with intention. So we do a lot of automated testing, and I think that's really important, with generative content, or when you have any game that has like a really vast world and a lot of output, then you need, generated testing, you need automatic testing. But not all of our testing can be done automatically. And you need to identify cases where that's not true, where you need like a human that's playing the game and saying, this feels slightly different, this terrain doesn't play quite as well to me, rather than a little bot flying over it and just taking screenshots every now and then that doesn't know how the game actually plays. Because especially with generative content, when you don't have a level designer that's made very explicit changes to a level, you've instead had an algorithm that's just made you a completely new level. There are subtle changes there that you need someone to play and pick up on. Another thing from this is that if you're generating output, if you're able to establish minimum and maximum solution situations, and then automate the testing of those, then you can say, like, this is the maximum amount of memory that we will ever use on this level. I know that I'm generating a maximum memory or minimum frame rate planet, and automate the testing of those. Then that's a really helpful thing to be able to do through your generators. And with all this stuff, you totally can introduce it later on. A lot of these things we've introduced, but the earlier you can think about them, the better off you're going to be. And that's partly because you can use them during the development process. The earlier your testers know that they're able to work continuously, even when they have saves and you're changing your generators and you're still working on them, that's going to be really helpful to them. And when I say testers, that might just be yourself if you're working on a solo project. I'm not just talking about really big games here. But not only that, for us, our update cycles are quite long. We release, one update every few months, and that's kind of like a typical console-based approach. And for anyone who is updating a thing, whether that's in early alpha, whether you have complete control and can do that really frequently, then there's still like costs to every time you update. There's the testing that you have to do and the preparation you have to do to be able to put that update out there. And any change that you want to make to your game to improve this generation might take multiple of those cycles to come into place. So for example, for some of those techniques I talked about to work, you might have to, in one update, store some data from the player's existing saves that they didn't have before. You might require them to go into game and load up their base so you can store the direction that it's facing in order for the next update you can move that base to a new location that turns it in a different direction. And you wouldn't be able to make that change in one update cycle. That's bound to take time and need the player to play the game in the meantime. So if you can think about it before you even ship your game, it's going to be a huge advantage there. So finally, I just want to conclude by going through a few of the principles that I talked about. So the first one is decide when you're generating. Don't assume that you're limited to generating offline or on load time or online until you've actually analyzed the memory and the requirements that you have. And make sure that that's a conscious decision, that you're deciding for a specific reason when you generate data. Assume that you're going to update the game. Assume, even if it's a little hobby project, assume that you're going to keep working on it, that you're going to deal with problems. Because, I mean, okay, so there's a limit to how much robustness you want to build into something that you never use, but it's always a little bit better to be safe than sorry. If you decide not to build robustness in, make that a conscious decision. Make it that the cost was too much, that I had to ship too soon, rather than just that I didn't think about the fact that I might keep working on this game forever. Build for addition. Assume that your updates to the game will add more content. Assume that you might double or triple the content in your game. And again, that doesn't mean preparing your game so you can do that. You don't have to be able to budget in memory and frame rate or have all the systems ready for it. But assume that that's a thing down the line that might happen and try not to close off any doors that would prevent that. Design for iteration. Design with procedural generation in mind that's going to change, that you're going to change your generators, that you're going to change the game. And support all that with adaptable and flexible gameplay. Try to have gameplay that will work with generative systems that work even if you change them, even if you move things, even if you rework the entire world. So finally, I have a couple of questions about where we're going with games and procedural generation. And again, I'm not looking for answers that are true for all games. I'm not saying this should replace what we do with games, but I think there's a space out there that's not really being exploited to do with change, to do with continuously evolving and updated games, and to do with procedural generation that there are some cool projects that we'll really make use of in future. So I said earlier that change was conflict, and I think for us at this point it's mostly true. Mostly, we have content locks months before we ship games, and those kind of have to happen. And we're always kind of frustrated because it's like, oh, I really wanted to get that change in. I mean, for us it's less than months, it's pretty short, but there's still that frustration. It's like, I wanted to ship that thing and now I can't because we're not able to change the project dramatically. But can we have our players expect change more fully? Can we expect that games will change more dramatically between updates? Can we expect that our generators will change and our games will become different things over time? Is that the idea of a game that we can work towards, rather than looking at it as this solid, monolithic thing that we ship once and people play as this sole idea of a game? Can we look at them more as being projects that are evolving over time, that are updated constantly and are played for a really long time period rather than just at launch? And we definitely see projects that are doing that to some extent, but it hasn't changed our idea overall of what a game is. We still talk about them as if they were the game that they were at launch, or the game that they were 2 years down the line, and nothing about the process in between that. And secondly, how can generative techniques drive our games as evolving entities? So if we see this space for games that are changing constantly over time, then what generative techniques would we create if we weren't looking to just generate this one field of output? If we were looking to generate content and then change that content and generate slightly different content and do that forever? So overall, a lot of those are thoughts rather than specifics, and they don't really indicate what we were working on as a company so much as my own personal view of procedural generation and change. But overall, what I hope you can take away is asking questions like, how will this technique adapt to change? How are we going to work with updating this game? Where is this project going to go? And just really embrace change, make things that are radically different from when you ship them, and constantly improve for years beyond them. So I really hope if you're working on procedural stuff, especially if it's your own project or you're a student, that those are the takeaways that you really think about after this. Thanks everyone.